variety of publications, including Tablet, the Washington Post, Commentary, Times Higher Education, Artist, The Forward, and other very prominent periodicals, outlets for publication. So please join me to welcome Professor William Kolbrener.
Thank you. Hi. Good morning. It's still considered morning, right? I was planning on giving a very conventional lecture on anti-Semitism. I met Charles in Tel Aviv, and he invited me to come here. In the interim, I went to Strasbourg. Has anybody been here? Anyone here been to Strasbourg? Yeah, it's an incredible city, right? You can see already that even though there are a lot of us, I'd like to kind of open it up from the very beginning and have a kind of seminar, right? So I'm not just asking rhetorical questions. So Strasbourg is an incredible city. In 1349, all of the Jews were rounded up in the public square and burnt. But apparently that was not only happening in Strasbourg, that was happening all over Europe because of fear of the Black Plague. However, in the history of anti-Semitism, Strasbourg does have its own distinction because in 1390, they were the first European city to throw all of the Jews out of their city. Of course, somebody could say, of course, the Jews were thrown out of England in 1240, but this was a European city that decided on its own to throw people out. One of the extraordinary things about Strasbourg, aside from it being an incredible cosmopolitan city, is that it has what was the highest structure in Europe until the 19th century, the Strasbourg Cathedral. It towers over the modern city. One can only imagine the way it towered over a medieval city. It took about 40 years for it to be put up, and it was put up really at about the same time that these anti-Semitic incidents were happening. It's incredible because on the one, you see the kind of contradiction of Europe. On the one hand, this is extraordinary beauty. It's one of the most beautiful cathedrals in the world. And on the other hand, the kind of subtext is the always present text of the destruction of if not the destruction of the Jews, violence against the Jews, murder of the Jews. And in Strasbourg, it just comes together. I wanted to start today. My talk today is on Jewish exceptionalism. I want to talk in a minute what I mean by Jewish exceptionalism. But we're going to start, I'll start with the Old Testament, then some 17th century readings of the Old Testament. You can tell I'm a literature theology person. And then moving on to the 20th century with political anti-Semitism, obviously Nazi Germany, and then to talk a little bit about anti-Semitism today, especially on the progressive left. It seems like a tall order, but I think we can do it. Anyway, so here is, in this image is from the cathedral. It's now in a museum across the street. It's called, I think in French, Église et synagogue, church and synagogue. So these were on different portals of the entrance to the church. And in these two images are represented Christianity and Judaism. As two sisters, it looks like, right? Can you see the image? I mean, it's a dark picture. You just saw it. Oh, so you're bored of this already. You saw it in what context? Oh, should he come back maybe? I don't know. Anyway, so since you're all experts now, I can rely upon you. So how do you read this image? How do you read this image?
Triumph of the church.
That's the symbol. Sure. Definitely the triumph of the church. What about some of,
synagogue is of course blind. What else did we just notice about the iconography or the symbols? What is she holding?
The broken cane.
Well, first of all, the
church is holding a crucifix and the chalice, which probably I think represents the Eucharist, and the woman, she's looking downcast and she's blindfolded and she's holding the book of the law in her hand, which it seems like she's about to drop. Anything else notable about this?
rectitude.
Who's rectitude? Here's a nice image.
Image of the synagogue.
Pardon?
the Christian as an image, the
Yeah.
woman is very,
Right.
she's erect, she's clear,
Right.
she is clearly on the right path.
Right.
Would you say, especially after your previous lecture, I mean, first of all, anti-Semitism, as we know, is a 19th century political phenomenon. But let's use it as a metaphor here. How anti-Semitic is this? Or maybe a better way of putting it, is there something about the representation which makes it more complicated? Let's see some more pictures here. Yeah, somebody had an idea? Yeah.
Well, the female Jewish woman is more eroticized.
Right. I mean, that is interesting. I mean,
Jewess, the Jew.
the Jew, yeah. You think she's more eroticized? Well, she looks more human. That's for sure, right? I mean, the fact that you said that the church stands upright makes
Synagogues not standing upright all the more prominent. Yeah.
You see it as eros, but I see it as vulnerability.
Sure.
And
There's obviously defeat there as well. Right.
But also, the image of the dejected synagogue really borrows from figures of the daughter of Zion in Lamentations, this idea of the destroyed, downtrodden, Jewish people represented as
Right.
Jewish people.
Right, and the appropriation here of that Old Testament image for this particular representation. They are sisters.
which is interesting, right? It could be more negatively represented. You've pointed out these things about her. I don't know if it's eroticism, but certainly about her humanity. I think the image in the museum across the street from the church had the caption that she's awaiting future redemption, which is, of course, obviously a very Christian reading, right? But I think in this image, there is a slight bit of ambivalence. There is, and I think that the Christian relationship to the Jews over the ages, generalization alert, is characterized by both anxiety and ambivalence, or maybe by ambivalence and anxiety. I think we see this kind of emphasis here. They're two sisters, they both have the same father, right? And the same mother, presumably. So they're allied, but obviously different. And the New Testament figure, she gains her rectitude. She becomes upright because of her reliance, in some sense, on her Jewish sister. I mean, that's not me reading the image necessarily, but it's certainly the history of the New Testament and the Old Testament. Which kind of gets me to my next question to talk about the title of my talk, exceptionalism. Would somebody help me define that? What does it mean to be exceptional? I mean, we all know what it means, Google definition-wise. Yeah.
Sociologically outside the norm, different from
Right.
majority.
I mean, exceptional can have, I guess
that's interesting. I was thinking of the more positive connotations, but it also can have those negative connotations as well. Uniqueness, right. Well, uniqueness, I think, is really important. Pardon?
So the question really is,
Go back to this image. If the church is dependent on some level to synagogue, like how do we understand that relationship? Are there any New Testament scholars here? No? So that's both good, that nobody's going to find that my silly. Are you a New Testament scholar? No. Early church. Well, that counts, right? Okay, so if I make any mistakes, you'll correct me. Is the Old Testament for Christians a problematic text? No. A resounding no.
well, yeah. I'm just wondering if you were setting up Christianity.
Let's say. And you had these new Gospels. What would you do with the old stuff? The rabbis next door are busy canonizing these texts, right? You want to keep it. Anybody? And if we had a conference on this, you know, would we keep it or jettison it? Yeah.
I think it's a concept of supersessionism.
Wait, you're talking faster than I am.
Sorry, the concept of supersessionism, where
Right.
you're keeping it, but you're keeping it within the context of understanding.
Supersession meaning that the Christians are superseding the
Right,
Jews.
The Jews are the Old Testament, the Old Covenant
Right,
God, and
right.
Christians become the New Covenant.
Right, and that's in that image. This is a supersessionist image, really, right? Yeah.
You definitely have to keep the Old Text, bearing in mind that the majority of the New Testament did not exist at the time of the early church,
Okay.
meaning that the validation for Christianity
I
came
see.
from the Old
Okay.
Testament.
I don't know the history of the Old Testament that well. Is there anybody who would be against it?
Yes,
Okay, Barbara, yes.
you only want to keep a portion of the prior text.
It's like the Mueller report, you erase some of it?
Yes. You eliminate anything that doesn't validate or prove your
All right.
perspective.
So Barbara's raising the point that the Old Testament, she's raising the point that that the Old Testament
As an independent text may have some connotations which would be problematic for Christians.
It's good foundational, and it legitimizes you, but you only keep the stuff that validates
Yeah.
your present existence. So references to this future Christ, future prophet, you keep that from the Old text. And you
I'm
make
sorry,
that the present
you keep everything, and the Old Testament will demonstrate the fact that Jesus was the Christ.
Oh,
You keep
wait.
everything,
So
plus you added other books that are not in the version of Judaism,
Yeah.
like the Maccabean, for
okay.
instance. Of
I
course,
mean,
it's even more complete than the Old
Wait
Testament.
a second, just wait a second. You're already adding an interpretive level, right? And,
No, but
and
it's
that-
the truth.
So
You
what-
read-
okay. I just want to get back to the question, as our New Testament scholar, or
Sorry, our early church scholar will tell you that it wasn't so simple to early Christians that they were going to include the Old Testament. That Augustine was up against a sect called the Manichaeans, right? The Manichaeans believe in a binary universe. It's kind of like the Star Wars universe. There's a force of good and a force of evil. And obviously Augustine opposed them on that as well. And a lot of Augustine's writing is reflecting his dialogue with the Manichaeans. The Manichaeans said, let's get rid of this text. It was Augustine, and I'm sure it's a more complicated story than I'm representing it, it was Augustine who made sure that the Old Testament became the Old Testament. Meaning before that it was the Jewish scriptures, right? When Augustine and the early church now canonizes the Bible, right, as New Testament and Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, right? I don't go to shul every Saturday morning and take a Old Testament off the shelf, right? Take something, I take the 5 books of Moses, right? So Augustine felt that the Old Testament should be included. The Manichaeans, however, opposed it. Yeah? Did you have a comment? Yeah.
I was just going to add, because I wanted everyone else to talk and say something. So yeah, the Manichaean thing is really important. I think also we have to think about when they were trying, I'm thinking like 4th century, if you're trying to, a little bit early, if you're trying to convert people and you have certain things, for example, which would be in the Old Testament that wouldn't work with them, such as prescriptions about clothing or food, that you wouldn't want to include that. Right. Circumcision. Also, we have this view from modern times of like the Bible as one book, but that's not how it worked. They would pick Old Testament books that would further their mission, and that's what they would use. Not even just looking at England, the monasteries didn't even have all the Old Testament books. They would have all the Gospels, but they would pick and choose certain Old Testament books.
So if you
can't
want-
think of it as one unified.
if you want the more complicated story,
Talk to her at lunch. Right, yeah.
If I may add,
pardon?
If I may add something, the Manichaeans, they were not Christian. You speak about the Marcionite.
Okay.
It was the Marcionite to reject any origin of the Jewish people. The Manichaeans, actually Saint Augustine was a Manichaean.
Okay.
But they were from Persia. They had
Okay.
nothing to do with all the scripture. Nothing to do. They were not Christian. They were the Marcionite.
What I want to just be sensitive to
Is the way in which what we call the Old Testament might be problematic for Christians. And it becomes problematic, yeah, in the back, yeah?
Just, when you say what we call the Old Testament, who is the we here?
Oh, sorry. I'm doing the normative scholarly way. I do this in the classroom in Israel.
I'm just used to the
Yeah.
Torah and the Gospels, because Old and New and
Okay. You guys are a tough audience, all right? I'm just doing my best. I'm doing my best here, okay? All right, I mean, obviously, there's going to be some...
Subtlety and nuance to what I had a professor in university who used to speak about what he called bumpkin histories. A bumpkin history is a kind of simplistic, broad stroke history. So why do you tell it? Because it can be useful, right? And then over lunch, you talk to all the really smart people, right? And you fill in the gaps, right? The story I'm telling is necessarily simplistic, but it can be, I think it's a useful one to have, a useful frame. Yes?
It's just a small point. In the time of Augustine,
Yeah.
what was kept in the Old Testament was not the Hebrew Bible.
Okay.
You have Jerome translating it into a Latin Bible, which supersedes the Hebrew Bible.
Okay. So there are all sorts of things having to do with the history of translation, which will also be significant. Do you have a handout that I handed out?
Yeah.
Can I have one of them? Thank you. Right. I mean,
What's a problematic text in the Old Testament? In Galatians, Paul writes, "To Abraham were the promise made, and to his seed being Zera Yaakov, Zera Yitzchak, right? The seed of Yitzchak, the seed of Yaakov. He saith not, and to his seeds, as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed," which is Jesus Christ. This is what whoever was sitting there before was commenting upon, is one way of dealing with the text that's problematic is through interpretation. But why is this particular text problematic? I mean, what is this? What is the simple meaning of the text in the Old Testament when it refers to the seed of Abraham? Make believe. Let's be biblical scholars. What's the simple meaning? The people of Israel, right? And that's a problem for Christians. Meaning, if I'm going to retain all of the stories in Genesis, then I have to deal with the apparent claim again and again and again of Jewish exceptionalism. And I think that fact of Jewish exceptionalism back to the Old Testament is always a source of a kind of Christian anxiety. Looking back at our picture, I would see both anxiety and ambivalence. Now, anxiety can express itself in many ways, right? Anxiety, as we'll see with Martin Luther, can express itself in a kind of violence or call for violence. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Here, what was Paul's original name?
Saul of Tarsus, Shaul HaTarsi. So when he had his revelation on the way to
Damascus. Paul is, I think, what the literary critic Harold Bloom, do you know his name? Right? Harold Bloom is a famous critic of Shakespeare, of Milton. He wrote a famous book called The Anxiety of Influence. Instead of seeing the relationship of text as traditional, he sees later authors not coming and representing the tradition of earlier authors, but really great authors, what they do is they kill off their predecessor. So Milton, when writing Paradise Lost, kills off, who would he have to kill off? Homer and Virgil. Meaning you look back to the past and you see these really great texts, and in some sense they make you, why would they make you anxious? They already did everything. Who can write after Homer? Who can write after Virgil? Milton says, I can, but in order to do that, he has to kind of push them aside. When Milton himself became a poet as well, he looked at, it was not only Milton, it was not only Homer and Virgil, it was also, of course, Shakespeare, right? How can you write after Shakespeare? How can you do anything after Shakespeare? So Bloom refers to people like Milton as a strong reader. And I think the strongest reader in the entire Western tradition is Paul, because he takes the Old Testament and he reads it strongly as he appropriates it entirely for Christianity.
Meaning, in some sense, it's Paul really who is creating Christianity through yeah.
I just interject here.
Yeah, please.
Paul himself was Jewish. There was no such thing as Christianity as people understand it back then. He was Jewish, thing he simply given a not interpretation of Judaism.
Pardon?
Paul is simply given a not interpretation of Judaism.
Okay, well, okay. It's a very strong reading of Judaism. You could say the same thing about the rabbis of the Talmud. They're giving an interpretation of Judaism. Okay, fine. Yeah, fine. Good. Okay.
So Paul here is rereading the Old Testament text. It really doesn't refer to Israel. Rather, it refers to, what does he read? And to thy seed. Who is the seed of Christ? Everybody, right? So we take a particularist text, a text which emphasizes the exception, and we turn it into something universal. Luther, another of the great strong readers, right? Here's from his book, The Jews and Their Lies. Has this come up at all during this past week? Have you ever read any of this? Luther is quite a master of polemic. This, can you guys all have it, or should I put it up on the screen? Everybody has. This I want, everybody does not have it. Okay. Okay. This I wanted to say for strengthening of our faith. Oopsie. Jews will not give up their pride in boasting about their nobility and lineage. What do Jews boast about? Nobility and lineage. The source of their nobility is their lineage. As was said above, their hearts are hardened. Our people, however, must be on their guard against them, lest they be misled by this impenitent, accursed people who give God the lie and haughtily despise all the world. Not too much ambivalence here, right? For the Jews would like to entice us Christians to their faith, and they do this wherever they can. If God is to become gracious also to them, the Jews, they must first of all banish such blasphemous prayers and songs that boast so arrogantly about their lineage, from their synagogues, from their hearts, and from their lips. For such prayers ever increase and sharpen God's wrath towards them. However, they will not do this, nor will they humble themselves abjectly, except for a few individuals whom God draws unto himself particularly and delivers them from terrible ruin. Why is Luther so concerned with this lineage business?
It's the same anxiety that Paul has, right? I mean, Luther's expressing it much more aggressively. That Jews are claiming to be a special people. And how do they claim to be a special people? On the basis of their particularity.
The basis of their being an exception. And throughout church history, there is this anxiety about Jewish exceptionalism. Luther continues, Dear Moses, what do you mean? Luther starts out by quoting something from Deuteronomy in which Moses tells the people of Israel that they should circumcise their hearts. So Luther says, well, what does that mean? Meaning, if you're circumcising your heart, then you don't have to circumcise your flesh. Does it not suffice that they are circumcised physically? They are set apart from all other nations by this holy circumcision and made a holy people of God. And you rebuke them for stubbornness against God? You belittle their holy circumcision? You revile the holy circumcised people of God? It's very strong reading here. You should venture to talk like that today in their synagogues? If there were not stones conveniently near, they would resort to mud and dirt to drive you from their midst, even if you were worth 10 Moseses. What is Luther saying? Why is Moses a good guy, according to Luther?
Because Moses understood, in rebuking the Jewish people to circumcise their heart, that was what was most important. And Moses here is represented as having a kind of knowledge that the Jews themselves didn't have.
By virtue of such futile, arrogant circumcision in the flesh, they presume to be God's only people until the foreskin of their heart has become thicker than an iron mountain. That's a lot of metaphors there, right? And they can no longer hear, see, or feel their own clear scripture, which they read daily with blind eyes, overgrown with a pelt thicker than the bark of an oak tree. I didn't know Luther was such a poetic figure. But again, we see this sense of anxiety in relationship to Jewish particularism. I think Luther calls in the Jews in their lives for the burning down of for the burning down of synagogues. Meaning for Luther, the very presence of the Jew is problematic. Are there any historians, what Luther says here about Jews converting Christians, how common was that? I can't imagine very common, right? So you see that kind of anxiety and this creating of a threat that doesn't even really exist. Okay, can I just take a 30-second break? I do this in my classes all the time. Yeah, it's okay, we can do that? You can stretch also? I make a distinction between stretching breaks, bathroom breaks, and coffee breaks. This is a stretching break. Okay. Okay. Who here has read Paradise Lost? Oh, so it's such an educated group of people. Nobody ever raises their hand when I say this. Not even my students, unfortunately, when we're reading it. See this, I can tell when I put the poetry on the board, people are getting like yawning and feeling bored, but this is for me the exciting part, right? So we'll read a little poetry, and then we'll come to 20th century anti-Semitism, stuff that's much more directly in our purview. So this is Milton's famous invocation to Paradise Lost. In writing Paradise Lost, Milton is claiming a kind of holy inspiration, which of course is an enormous amount of chutzpah, right? And while Homer, in his epics, calls out to the 9 muses, Milton, on several occasions, will call out to his muse, but his muse is a little bit different than the muse of the Homeric works. So, 26 lines. We'll read them a bit at a time. Of man's first disobedience in the fruit of that forbidden tree, whose mortal taste brought death into the world, and all our woe with loss of Eden. What are the first 4 lines characterized by? First 4.5 lines? It's actually after Genesis. I mean, it's the text Genesis, right? It's Adam and Eve having fall. It's a bummer here, right? Disobedience, mortality, death, woe, loss. Now the Christian kicker, till one greater man restore us and regain the blissful seat. Who's the one greater man? Jesus. Right? Sing, heavenly muse, that on the secret top of Oreb or Sinai. What's Oreb? Oreb is the mountain in Israel, Horeb. Or Oreb or of Sinai. Milton's favorite word is or. Didst inspire that shepherd. Who's that shepherd? Yeah? Okay, Moses. Yeah, I mean, that's what it's going to be. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Different muse here, right? You see that Milton is obviously saying to Virgil and Homer, you did that already, but what I'm going to do is much better. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed. Who's that? Jews, right? And here is talk about chutzpah. This is the most chutzpah-dick line in all of English poetry. That shepherd who first taught the chosen seed in the beginning, how the heavens and earth rose out of chaos. Milton is incorporating the Bible into his text. Or, if Sion Hill delight thee more, what's Sion Hill? Har Zion, Mount Zion in Jerusalem. Or Silo is brook, Shiloh, that flowed fast by the oracle of God. Where do you usually find oracles? Right. It's here Milton. I'm just Milton a ton of different things here. One of the things he's doing is taking an earlier classical tradition and incorporating it into his poem. So Milton's Paradise Lost, somebody used the term before, is a supersessionist poem, right? It's superseding not only, as we'll see, the Jews, but it's also superseding Virgil and Homer. English culture is the best ever, and my poem is the best ever. He really thinks this. He really thinks this. Fast, and he's almost right. Fast by the oracle of God, I thence invoke thy aid to my adventurous song, that with no middle flight intends to soar above the Aeonian Mount. The Aeonian Mount, of course, is in Greece, and his poem is going to soar over it, while it pursues things unattempted, yet in prose or rhyme. I'm going to write something that nobody else has ever written before. Before all temples And chiefly thou, O Spirit. Here we're getting back to the Christian stuff. Chiefly thou, O Spirit. Before we said in Homer and Virgil, there were 9 classical muses, goddesses. Who's Milton's muse? And chiefly thou, O Spirit. He's a Christian, remember? It's the Holy Spirit. And chiefly thou, O Spirit, that dost prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. What's Milton doing here with these lines? Does prefer before all temples the upright heart and pure. What's better? The particular building that was built in Jerusalem, made of rocks and stones and marble. What's better than that? And what's happening really with Luther and Milton and Donne and Shakespeare, of course, is kind of the invention of subjectivity. I mean, obviously it's Christian, but there's a real emphasis on interiority here, right? What's more important is not the external world. What's more important is the internal world. Was present and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss and made it pregnant. What in me is dark, illumine, what is low, raise and support, that to the height of this great argument I may assert eternal providence. I want to just focus on these lines. Thou from the first was present, and with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sats brooding on the vast abyss. Who is he calling out to here? I mean, this is a continuation of, and chiefly thou, O Spirit. And that Spirit, says Milton, thou, you, from the first was present, at the very beginning, at the beginning of Genesis. And with mighty wings outspread, dove-like sat brooding on the vast abyss and made it pregnant. What is Milton referring to in Genesis? I think I have it. Is there something like that in Genesis? Right? Here's the Hebrew. Okay. It says sorry. With this. Yeah. So the Hebrew, v'haaretz hayta tov v'vo, v'choshech al panei atom, v'ruach Elokim merachepet al panei hamayim. And does anybody know Hebrew here? Some people, yeah? How would you translate that? Ruach Elokim merachepet. Yeah?
God is floating over the face of the water.
Right. So ruach is the key term here, right? And ruach can mean wind. I've seen it translated as wind. Now yeah. Well, sure. I mean, Milton is obviously going with that, right? But I see that maybe some of your responses, maybe some of you had Christian educations, are spirit, right? My students' response is, what? Because they are familiar with the text and their understanding of the text from their tradition. But what Milton is doing here is the same thing that we saw Paul doing, that is taking the Christian text, taking the Jewish text and rendering it Christian. So much so that when we go back and read the earlier line about that shepherd, who is that shepherd now after we've read this 27 lines? Jesus. It's Jesus, right? Which really transforms the whole idea of chosen seed. It's almost like Luther is hiding there, or Paul is hiding there inside of Milton's story. The thing that's really incredible about Paradise Lost, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, is that if interpretive work needed to be done on the Old Testament, as we were suggesting earlier, Augustine and Paul do that as interpretation, meaning they interpret the text. Milton rewrites the text, incorporating all of that Protestant interpretation. It's almost like, if this is resonant for you, a kind of Christian midrash. A midrash is a rabbinic tale, a rabbinic interpretive story. And it's almost like Milton is taking the Old Testament and then rewriting it, doing exactly what you guys automatically said in relationship to what I was, when I referred to the chosen seed. You already had those interpretations in place. So Milton has them in place, and he tells the story over. Well, so for sure. It's definitely, I mean, I would have thought first of all, it's a pastoral shepherd, somebody who would go out to one of the gardens with sheep.
Then it's Moses, but ultimately it's Christ. Right. Okay. No, I would not argue with you that the simple meaning is Moses. Of course it's Moses, right? Of course it's Moses. But when after I read 26 lines, I think I see more than I thought I saw at the beginning. Okay. Let's see. I mean, so all of these texts really, starting with our image of church and synagogue, express some kind of relationship between the church and the Jews. I live in Israel now, and years ago I went to Berlin. And I had to decide, like, am I going to do the Jewish concentration camp tour, or am I going to hear symphonies, right? I decided to hear symphonies in the end, right? And I thought of those two things as being really separate. But really, the history of Europe is inseparable from anti-Semitism. It bases itself on it in some sense. Because as we're seeing here, all of later Christian representations of Christianity have to come to terms with the Old Testament. It's always there. And the Jew is a reminder. Luther found this reminder so problematic that he wanted to burn their shuls, to burn their synagogues. Because the Jews are a persistent reminder of another perspective, of another way. So I think at the heart of Christianity is this tremendous anxiety in relationship to Judaism. And anxiety can manifest itself in various forms. And it can manifest itself, for example, in the anger and violence of Luther, which is in contrast to what we saw in that image from the Strasbourg Cathedral. And that same kind of violence that's present in Luther obviously gets expressed in the 20th century as well. I think on Wikipedia it says the Jews and their lies did not lead up to the Nazis, but was just a part of the traditions of medieval anti-Semitism. So I don't know what some historian will probably have to say. What are the continuities between those things, between medieval anti-Semitism and the anti-Semitism of the Nazis? Just changing gears now to 20th century anti-Semitism and 21st century anti-Semitism, but still focusing on exceptionalism and the problem of Jewish exceptionalism. So there's a literary critic named George Steiner, absolutely brilliant guy, who gave some lectures at Yale in 1970. He was responding to lectures that T.S. Eliot had given earlier called Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. And in 1970, Steiner gives lectures at Yale called subtitled Notes Towards the Definition of Culture. It's called In Bluebeard's Castle. Steiner, I think, was compelled to do it again because Eliot is writing Notes Towards the Definition of Culture in the 40s and makes no mention of the Jews and no mention of the Holocaust. And Steiner says we have to go back to that. And he goes back to this and provides a reading of anti-Semitism as, again, a protest against exceptionalism. Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
The whole? Okay.
Let's go back. Let's go to our sheets. We're skipping Spinoza. Read that in your spare time. Right. Okay. That intent takes us to the heart of certain instabilities in the fabric of Jewish culture, of Western culture, in the relations between instinctual and religious life. You see what he's doing is inflected by Freud, obviously. Hitler's jibe that Hitler's jibe that conscience is a Jewish invention provides a clue. He goes on, and we'll keep that distinction between instinctual and religious life. It's a terrifying article that he writes, a book. The Holocaust is a reflex, the more complete for being long inhibited of natural sensory consciousness, of instinctual, polytheistic, and animistic needs. Europe has been repressed for hundreds of years, and it really wants to express its animist and polytheistic desires. In the Holocaust, there was both a lunatic retribution, a lashing out against intolerable pressures of vision, and a large measure of self-mutilation. For Steiner, the Holocaust represents Europe killing itself. By killing the Jews, by killing their conscience, they were destroying itself. The secular, materialist, warlike community of modern Europe sought to extirpate from itself, from its own inheritance, archaic, now ridiculously obsolete, but somehow inextinguishable carriers of the ideal. The carriers of the ideal being the Jews. Again, the reference points here are not so much theological. Europe is described as secular, warlike, and materialist. And yet, there's still that unignorable presence of the Jews. They are the carriers of the ideal. In the Nazi idiom of vermin and sanitation, there is a brusque insight into the infectious nature of morality. You see, he's a great writer, right? A brusque insight into the infectious nature of morality. And according to Steiner, Europe wants to inoculate itself from morality. What's wrong with morality? Well, in Steiner's register, we'll talk about 21st century register in a bit. In Steiner's register, morality is the thing that doesn't allow one's animist and polytheistic and irrational instincts to express themselves. Monotheism at Sinai, primitive Christianity, messianic socialism, these are the three supreme moments in which Western culture is presented with what Ibsen termed the claims of the ideal. These are the three stages profoundly interrelated through which Western consciousness is forced to experience the blackmail of transcendence. Unceasingly, the blackmail of perfection has hammered at the confused, mundane, egotistical frame of common, instinctual behavior, like a shrilling note in the inner ear. Men are neither saints nor ascetics. Their imaginings are gross. Ordinarily, their sense of the future is the next milestone. But the insistence of the ideal continued with a terrible, tactless force. I find this particularly haunting given what's happening in Europe today, meaning a lot of what we've taken for granted for decades and a few generations, I'm speaking really as an American now, the existence of democracy really seems to be challenged by what's happening all over the world. Eastern Europe, with the kind of return of demagoguery. And of course, when demagogues return, they allow for the expression of these irrational forces. A friend of mine said that our grandparents would never have taken anything for granted in America, and they never did, because for them, all they knew was a history of violence against them. It's only contemporary Americans, American Jews, who are like, what? You know, everything's great. And everything has been great. But here Steiner is bringing out this sense of there are these irrational forces, and democracy is a very delicate experiment. That's my commentary. The mechanism is simple but primordial. We hate most those who hold out to us a goal, an ideal, a visionary promise, which even though we have stretched our muscles to the utmost, we cannot reach, which slips again and again, just out of range of our racked fingers, yet, and this is crucial, which remains profoundly desirable, which we cannot reject because we fully acknowledge its supreme value. In his exasperating strangeness, his exceptionalism, in his acceptance of suffering as a part of a covenant with the absolute, the Jew became, as it were, the bad conscience of Western history. As Hamlet says, conscience does make cowards of us all. And in a sense, that's what Steiner is saying in relationship to Europe. It made them cowards in regard to expressing their deepest desires and irrational lusts. In him, the abandonment of spiritual and moral perfection, the abandonments of spiritual and moral perfection, the hypocrisies of an established mundane religiosity, the absence of a disappointed, potentially vengeful God were kept alive and visible. So the Jews are the carriers of the ideal. It's interesting that for Steiner, it's not only Moses, also Jesus, also Marx, and to some extent, I think also Freud, that they are the carriers of the ideal. Yeah. Oopsie. The genocide was no mere secular socioeconomic phenomenon. It enacted a suicidal impulse in Western civilization. We have this old expression, Western culture is dead. Can you still see that? You know, you see a tweet online and you think, oh, now Western culture is dead, right? It's rock bottom now. And the next day you see something else. Well, Steiner was saying it in the 70s, right? It enacted a suicidal impulse in Western civilization. It was an attempt to level the future, or more precisely, to make history commensurate with its natural savageries, intellectual torpor. You'd think he's a little bit of elitist, Steiner, and material instincts of unextended man. What he means really is uneducated man, right? Using theological metaphors, and there is no need to apologize for them in an essay on culture, the Holocaust may be said to mark a second fall. We can interpret it as a voluntary exit from the garden and a programmatic attempt to burn the garden behind us. It's not only that we're leaving paradise, we're destroying it on the way out. Steiner is this lonely figure, right? He's this figure of enormous learning, living in what he considers to just be a culture of complete, not only immorality, but lack of any education or culture. Lest its remembrance continue to infect the health of barbarism. Is barbarism healthy in the world today? With debilitating dreams or with remorse. Don't make barbarians self-conscious. And the people who are best at making barbarians self-conscious over the years, over the generations, over the centuries, over the millennia, have been the Jews. And for Steiner, Hitler's final solution is the destruction of the Jews. Turn Judaism into a museum. Hitler said to the community in Prague that he wanted to turn Judaism into a museum, or he said that in general. Now, if you go to Prague, I got a ticket for the Jewish Museum. The Jewish Museum is the city, right? It allows you to go into all these different synagogues, cemeteries. There's one synagogue which has the names of all of the people, 70,000, who were killed during the Holocaust. And the brochure where I read about Hitler's plan was from this synagogue, and the synagogue considered itself to be a protest. Look, we did this, we made this. But in a sense, I thought to myself, they fulfilled what Hitler wanted, right? Because in Prague, there are Jews who live in Prague still, but in terms of a vibrant Jewish community, there's nothing there, nothing, right? So Hitler, his idea was to turn all of Europe into a museum. We can look at the Jews in a museum. We don't want them around us. They make us uncomfortable. Now, can I walk with this? Yeah? Yeah? So what's the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? I ask you because you've been thinking about it for a week, and I just came from a conference on John Milton. So give me something to work with. I mean, is there still a protest against Jewish exceptionalism? Pardon?
A lot of anti-Zionism
Right.
is couched in a belief in Israel's conspiratorial
Right.
relationship with like Western governments and everything bad that happens, and
Right.
that's couched in
Right.
massive.
So a lot of the same kind of tropes that are used by anti-Semites are also used by anti-Zionists. What was the first thing you said? Right. I mean, also this idea that there's some kind of Jewish conspiracy behind all of history. And anything else about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
There's also, certain specific things about killing Palestinian babies, things that recall the
Blood libels in the 12th and 13th century. Right. To get a little more insight into that, and I really want to get to talk about progressive anti-Semitism. For me, I had this like revelation of understanding the problematic nature of left anti-Semitism, because by nature I'm a liberal. And I find myself in many cases agreeing with a left-wing agenda. So it made it much harder for me to see the anti-Semitism on the left. The anti-Semitism on the right I have no problem seeing in Trump's America, right? But there is an equal problem with left-wing anti-Semitism, and in many ways it's much more sophisticated than right-wing anti-Semitism. Steiner gives those lectures in 1970. In 1986, he writes not about the Jews, but about Israel. And through this piece, I'd like to start, after we look at this piece, I'd like to talk a little bit more about progressives. Let's see. Okay. At the same time, doubtless, the centrality of the book does coincide with and enact the condition of exile. There are radical senses in which even the Torah is a place of privileged banishment from the tautological immediacy of Adam's speech. He's having a good time here, right? Reading textual exegesis are an exile from action, from the existential innocence of praxis, even where the text is aiming at practical and political consequences. You might wish that he writes a little bit more simply here. What's he saying here? Reading and textual exegesis are an exile from action. I mean, we see the beginning of the framing of the Jew as in an ideal world of the text. The Jew is understood in relationship to the text. The textuality of the Jewish condition, from the destruction of the temple to the foundation of the modern state of Israel, has been seen by Zionism as one of tragic impotence. The text was the instrument of exile, survival. That survival came within a breath of annihilation. To endure it all, the people of the book had once again to be a nation. For Steiner, moving from that position of people of the book to a nation is a letdown. The Jews don't occupy the realm of action or praxis. They occupy the realm of the text. It's an interesting representation of the Jews, right? A true thinker, I love this, a true thinker, just in case you don't get it, he's hitting you over the head, right? A true thinker, a scholar must know, this is Steiner's autobiography, right? That no nation, no body politic, no creed, no moral ideal and necessity, be it that of human survival, is worth of a falsehood, a willed self-deception, or the manipulation of a text. He can't possibly mean this, can he? He says it's worse to misinterpret a text, presumably intentionally, than the possibility of putting human survival at risk. A true scholar knows that the most important thing is getting the text right. I mean, he starts out the first paragraph saying, we understand that Zion had to be founded. It was it was a necessity. But here he seems to be saying that all that matters is the text. The knowledge and observance are his homeland. It is the false reading that makes him homeless. The prophetic and the speculative addition to insight are the nationhood of Judaism. How is Steiner characterizing the Jewish people here? It's like this ideal entity, right? This ideal entity in some kind of virtual study hall that extends over the generations and every possible place. How can a thinking man, basically, Steiner is saying there is an incommensurability between a Jew being human and interpreting texts and a Jew having a state. This is kind of almost a primer, as we'll see, for progressive anti-Semitism. When the Jew has a nation, he ceases to be a man. He becomes something else. We'll see, he speaks it out. How can a thinking man, a native of the world, be anything but the most wary and provisional of patriots? Real intellectuals, says Steiner, can't be patriots. The nation-state is founded on the myths of instauration and patriotism. It perpetuates itself by lies and half-truths, machine guns and submachine guns. That is the alternative to this idea of truth and truth-seeking and reading the text properly are machine guns and submachine guns. You can see it's getting to Israel soon, right? The sole citizenship of the cleric is that of a critical humanism. This is like Steiner's philosopher king, right? He knows not only that nationalism is a sort of madness, a virulent infection. I like the way infection returns to his work here. It starts out as being the infection of morality. Now it's the infection of nationalism, edging the species towards a mutual massacre. The man or woman at home in the text is by definition a conscientious objector to the vulgar mystique of the flag and the anthem. Steiner, by the way, lives in Switzerland. It's a kind of important fact, right? Here we go. Here now, Israel is a nation state to the utmost degree. So we start out with this whole discussion of the Jewish homeland as textual. Steiner goes on to talk about patriotism as a kind of vulgarity, even an obscenity. And now we get to Israel. Israel is a nation state to the utmost degree, like no other. It lives armed to the teeth. 1986. It has been compelled to make other men homeless, servile, disinherited in order to survive from day to day. As it was during 2 millennia, the dignity of the Jew, that he was too weak to make any other being as unhoused, as wretched as himself. The propaganda of Israel, its rhetoric of self-deception, are as desperate as any contrived in the history of nationalism. It's interesting, the same person who was able to write with such eloquence about anti-Semitism, well, he's writing with equal eloquence about Israel, but his view of Israel is pretty radically strong. I mean, what does it mean, Israel is a nation state to the utmost degree? What is he saying by that? I mean, the way I would look at it is that all nation states are built inevitably upon violence, power, and blood. In Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, some of you have read it, Athens is founded at the end, and the Furies, who all they demand through the 3 plays is blood, they're given blood-red robes, and they protect the city. And Aeschylus is acknowledging there that every city, it has to incorporate violence into it. And it seems to be that from Steiner's perspective, Israel is a nation state to the utmost degree, only Israel gets blamed for protecting itself. Only Israel gets blamed, I don't even mean that. Only Israel gets blamed for the way in which a nation state must necessarily protect itself. For Steiner, when Israel becomes a nation, when it becomes a nation state, it loses its real identity. Where are my papers here? Okay. There is no, but then he makes the same concession, right? There is no singular vice in the practice of the state of Israel. These follow ineluctably on the simple institution of the modern nation state. Makes my point, right? On the political military necessities by which it exists with and against its nationalist competitors. It is by empirical need that a nation state sups on lies, where it has traded its homeland in the text for one of the Golan Heights or in Gaza. Eyeless was the clairvoyant epithet of that great Hebraist, Milton. Judaism has become homeless to itself. Judaism, by gaining its home, has become a home. I mean, here he does make a concession to the needs of a state, but we'll see that he kind of rounds on that. The notion that the appalling road of Jewish life and the ever-renewed miracle of survival should have as their end, as their justification, the setting up of a small state in the Middle East, crushed by military burdens, petty and even corrupt in its politics, shrill in its patriotism, parochialism, is implausible. Steiner is saying here that it's not possible that 2,000 years of suffering should end with this. The betrayal of the text. So for Steiner, Jews have chosen particularity of nationhood and somehow betrayed their universalist agenda. Are there ways that we can see in which progressives borrow from this playbook? Progressives also have an antipathy to Jewish particularism. In the 20th century, when the great literary authors were writing narratives of return, the great literary modernists, Joyce writes Ulysses, The Return to Athens, right? T.S. Eliot writes The Wasteland, it's also a return narrative. Pound is also writing stories that go back to the ancient world. The Jews are the only people in history, or the Jews in the 20th century actually live out the destiny of their literary text. Meaning for others, it's a fiction of return. The Jews return to their land. Joyce and Eliot are the great writers of literary modernism. This idea of high culture, of return, of cohesion, of the special nature of Greece. Where literary modernists will emphasize that special exclusion. Postmodernists, by contrast, are not interested in any kinds of differences. So the Jew stands as having returned to Israel, and we're the one nation state that is still living out the modernist narrative in a postmodern world. The postmodern world says really nothing is privileged. Everything is the same. Nobody can make a privileged argument over another person. Is there a better definition of postmodernism that I could be using here? Is there a better version of postmodernism that I could be using here? Right, everything is fluid.
was the definition that you used? I'm sorry.
I think the definition I would suggest of postmodernism is this moral leveling.
Living in a relative world. And living in a relative world, Jews are still making the same kinds of claims. Or Jews, we went back to Israel. The myth that literary modernists could only write about was lived by Israelis, was lived by Jews. Again, so it's the modernist narrative triumphing, or the modernist narrative in a postmodern world. And the postmodern relationship to Jewish exceptionalism is you can't make such claims to exceptionality. Yeah, Sylvia.
So there's another dimension that you see in Steiner, which is elevating the intellectual
For sure.
and delegitimating embodiedness.
Right.
And so
Right.
he's making a demand
Right.
of Jews
Right.
that
Excellent.
they're all mind and there's no physicality.
When of course the Jewish tradition is so much caught up with embodiment and action. And the idea of embodiment and action goes on to the state of Israel. Of course, it doesn't mean that the state of Israel is blameless, but for progressives looking at the state of Israel, it's all or nothing. Israel must be perfect or it should be nothing. With other nation states, we don't make the same kinds of claims. We don't, for example, I'm an American and an Israeli. In America, nobody in Israel comes up to me and says, so how do you feel about America now? Meaning they'll say, how do you feel about Trump? But people will come up to me and say, what do you think about Israel based upon Bibi? And suggest that somehow that the entire project is illegitimate. Nobody suggests the illegitimacy of the American project. Is the American project flawed? Yeah, right? But I'm going to go back into what we said earlier. It's flawed, but it's a good model, right? And the Israeli model is also a good model. And that's somehow what gets lost, is that that progressives will look to Israel and say, if you can't meet up to the various highest standards, and this is Steiner too, if you can't meet up to the very highest standards, erase yourselves. Your survival is not so important. Read the text properly. Go to yeshiva and learn properly, right? It's a crazy argument, and as you're all suggesting, it undermines one of the basic precepts of Judaism, which is embodied. Is it embodied in an imperfect way in Israel? Absolutely. I mean, there are some you probably know in the religious world who also think in mystical terms, and they think that any attempt to have a state in Israel is contrary to God's will. You see these crazy people with the Iranian prime minister, Orthodox Jews, they're called the Turi Karta, right? They say also, there should be no Jewish state. We should eradicate the Jewish state. They have the same sensibility, though. All or nothing. If it's not perfect, delivered by God, the temple coming down magically, it's nothing. And that's the claim that progressives will continue to have against Israel, that we're not perfect. Yeah.
But in addition, progressivism has also become an ideology that, when it articulates about Israel, utilizes all of the historic tropes, demonization, besides Jewisization, and again, the blood libel is throughout their criticism. They still speak, and there's no similar examination of the tunnels of the Palestinian community.
Right, for sure.
Or that the Palestinians require what the Jews do not require.
Right.
Everybody knows this concept of intersectionality? Yes. Are Jews part of that?
What is that?
Well,
We have an answer in the back, which is this.
Yeah. Of the intersectional coalition again?
Yeah.
Only if you're on the left.
Oh, well, yeah, in the back, yeah.
I don't think it's necessarily only if you're on the left. I think it's only if you're a stereotypical good Jew. But I also think that extends to other minority groups. Because if you don't fit into what people who are in power of the movement, who oftentimes are white people,
Right.
If you don't fit into their idea of what a black person or a Jewish person should behave like, then they are quick to criticize.
Right. Well, that's interesting. That happened with
The Chicago Dyke March, right? Where Jewish women who were Zionists were excluded because somehow Zionism doesn't really fit into that intersectional agenda. In some sense, progressives have taken up that Jewish mantle, though, the one that Steiner writes about, claiming that clarity of moral consciousness, which really has been so absent for decades, certainly on the left. That is, progressives are now occupying the space of the Jew, claiming the moral high ground, and demonizing the Jew as the evil other, the violent, I mean, really, the Jew as Israel. Yeah?
Noticing, I think, when you think about intersectionality, I think of like the Women's March in Russia, right? Where, you know, they have no problem with Jewish women marching or Jewish women participating, but it's as soon as you put the Israel, you know, the flag. So I think it's not the demonization of Jews, more the demonization of Israel.
Right, I think that's better said.
When you're talking about like good Jew, bad Jew type thing, like at school, there's a big controversy about Israel, like some speaker, and there was a guy, a Jewish guy, I used to be friends with, who basically
used to be friends with.
Yeah, used to be friends with. Well, he went on a rant about Israel. He was like, well, as a Jew, like, you know, I understand how we can't hold ourselves to these standards. It's going on to be perfect, you know, like all or nothing, you know, it has to be perfect. Because he just went and listed a whole bunch of things. I was like, well, you know, I'm a good Jew because I understand that Israel, you know, is basically trash at the moment.
It's virtue signaling.
Huh?
Virtue signaling.
Yeah, exactly. It's complete virtue signaling. And instead of just accepting the fact that, yeah, Israel's not perfect, and as a Jew, we should try to change it, it's like a complete disavowalment of the concept, which is what progressive left, I think, is kind of...
Right, I mean, right, so, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just had a question about what Steiner was saying. I just wanted to make sure, so you're saying that he was saying that nationalism has corrupted Jewish people's place as a people of the book.
Right, the place for the Jewish people is not to be a nation, or not to be a state, but to be a nation.
You weren't saying that, Steiner was saying that.
Steiner was saying that, right. Not to be a embodied state, but to be a nation, meaning in the broad sense. Yeah.
Is it possible just to get, a definition for the progressive left?
Okay.
Did you have one? Yeah.
No, I just want to know what we're criticizing, and I just want to be more clear on.
Well, I was starting to say that
there's a tenor, you know what I would call it? I think the progressive left is if Trump has a populist base, which is not interested
in democracy,
I think there's also a populist base on the left. Again, for me, it's harder to see because I identify with a lot of left politics. But there is a kind of embracing, not of democracy, but rather of belonging, that I need to belong to a certain group. And free speech, and listen, I'm not a right-wing free speech advocate, I'm a free speech advocate. And I also hate this idea that liberalism has now been associated with progressivism. I think to be a liberal is the ideal, and to fight against these narratives that progressives sometimes use, these demonizing narratives, as somebody pointed out. In a way, progressives are importing that same theological structure that has existed for centuries. And they are in the right. They are good. And who's evil? What's evil? Well, anything that's racist, sexist, etc. And I'm not advocating racism or sexism. But also, they're also, I think the anchor for progressivism, and I'm going to talk about this a little more tomorrow, is really their anti-Zionism. I think it starts there, that there is and this goes back to Steiner's argument, that the Jews represent a certain vision of civilization, a vision of hierarchy, of value, of morality, and progressive can't deal with that. So Jews are not really part of Jewish, or Zionists, as you said, right, are not part of intersectionality. And I think you can make the argument, actually, that intersectionality is built in a way to exclude the Jews, by definition. Yeah.
So progressives, they abhor nationalism in general. And maybe part of that because any nationalist claim is based on some sort of exceptionalism, like the American exceptionalism, which they're very much against. Like every 4th of July, American patriotic symbols became controversial.
Right, they just ripped down an American flag at one of these processing facilities in Texas and put up a Mexican flag.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that, so that conservatives like going at it apoplectic, right? Because it's creating that equivalence.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that it will be, so regardless of all the anti-Zionist claims, the core and the bottom of it is the nationalism and it has to do with Jewish exceptionalism, which postmodernists absolutely abhor. But it doesn't still, for me at least, like I totally believe in this model, conservative model, but it doesn't still explain why this obsession, like the abhor all exceptionalism, all nationalism, but there's still a specific kind of obsession only about Israel.
I think it's Steiner's argument, the first one, is that the Jews have made a moral claim. We, Jews, monotheists, Jews, and then Christians, Steiner acknowledges,
invented monotheism, invented the ideal. And progressives are simultaneous, again, anxiety. The Jews represent, they are carriers of the ideal, on the one hand. On the other hand, now those who are screaming in the marketplace most about their ideals with the most conviction, I would almost say religious conviction, are progressives. Meaning, you can't have it, there are certain people you can't have a discussion with because their assumptions are such, it's like they're different theological models, different paradigms. And if you don't fit, I think you were saying this earlier, if you don't fit into that paradigm and have certain beliefs and certain ideas, then you're not part of it. Again, I'm saying in the progressive world, just like on the right with Trump's base, and again in America, populism is taking over. It's a sense of belonging and not democracy. It's almost, again, it's this Steiner's irrationalist urge for something that the rational doesn't supply. Yes?
I really want to encourage, when you see the word progressivism, that it is not limited to a set of sophisticated ideas that we can discuss or reject, but it is also including a set of behaviors. And why I say that is that I was able to get a hold of what is called the playbook of BDS, and they very carefully explain how you want to argue against Israel. And their first emphasis is on that when someone asks a sophisticated question, that is what you're doing with us, that you are to not answer them, that you are to physically move your body away. And when that doesn't work, it goes on to say that you can raise your voice in a certain way. So it is, again, a set of behaviors, strategies, techniques, which accompany the manifestations of what we're speaking about the end of liberal democracy, both of it potentially.
You brought up pedagogy, so let me
end with these comments, since I assume there are a lot of pedagogues here. I think the idea in a classroom, when talking about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is not to make a person a Zionist, necessarily. The idea is not to accept the progressive binary, the all or nothing. The Harvard philosopher Hilary Putnam said, "Enough may not be everything, but enough is enough." And that really should allow for the possibility of an Israeli state that isn't perfect. But again, your role as educators is not to have people go to the Israel Day parade, right? Your role of educators is to allow for conversation and discussion. And that means making students, I don't know if this is possible, who are maybe have a tendency towards BDS, to make them agnostics, to make them realize, and again, this is a version of Steiner's point, that their moral certainty evolves from the same set of paradigms that they're attacking. So the idea would be, the idea I think is to teach, obviously critical thinking And I think thinking about Israel-Palestine is a great way of developing critical thinking. If you don't, I mean, if you can avoid screaming in the classroom. Yes, one more question, then we'll end. Because
Yes, Philip Bautista, North Central University, Professor of Education, talk about pedagogy and pedagogy. Can you share, or anybody share, strategies or pedagogical techniques which have worked in the past with the two or groups or individuals who are fixed in a position and they're able to come together.
So
and then distinction of nationalism
and statehood.
And then the intellectual imposition of this is the moral issue whereby you're coming to replace me.
Yeah.
And the idea of how do we have a dialogue or discussion or whatever you call it. Because
I think we'll leave
and the language is, I see, which leads to rhetoric and all that. How can you, an example, just you can relate to, which you can move from there, an example, anybody who has ever.
I think maybe we should save the pedagogical discussions for lunch because people are signaling me in the back, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
But I think just a quick answer to your question is, again, not to aim for the extremes, to aim for the middle. When you have people dealing with different paradigms, it's very, those are the arguments, I mean, in a way, you don't want to argue with the BDS guy in the room. Or if you are arguing with him or her, what your comments are not directed to him or her, they're directed towards the middle, towards people who are still open-minded. Thanks.